On the 5th of July, 1932, Zachary Smith Reynolds was carried out of Reynolda House with a bullet wound behind his right ear. He was 20 years old, the youngest heir to the largest tobacco fortune in the United States, and he had been shot on the sleeping porch of a 1,000-acre estate his mother had built to be a model of progressive American life. His wife, the Broadway torch singer Libby Holman, claimed amnesia. His best friend, Albert Walker, claimed suicide. The sheriff believed neither of them. But the Reynolds family intervened before the case reached trial, and the truth was sealed inside a fortune that would grow over the next 7 decades into one of the most profitable and most lethal enterprises in American history. The R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company did not only bury a murder investigation, it buried the science that connected its product to the deaths of millions. The story of the Reynolds tobacco fortune begins not in the columned estate where a young man was shot, but in the red clay foothills of Patrick County, Virginia, where Richard Joshua Reynolds was born on the 20th of July, 1850. His father, Hardin Reynolds, was a prosperous tobacco farmer and manufacturer who grew dark-leaf plug tobacco on land that had been in the family for decades. The boy did not inherit his father's contentment with the local market. He attended Emory and Henry College for 2 years, left without graduating, and went to work in his father's factory, learning the process of curing, pressing, and flavoring chewing tobacco from the raw leaf to the finished plug. In 1873, while attending Bryant and Stratton Business College in Baltimore, he paid his tuition by selling his father's chewing tobacco to city merchants along the waterfront. He was not a scholar. He was a salesman with a manufacturer's instincts, and the combination would prove more dangerous than either quality alone. In 1874, at 24 years old, Reynolds sold his share of his father's business and traveled south to Winston, North Carolina, a town of perhaps 400 residents that possessed 2 qualities he valued above all others. Winston sat at the center of the new flu-cured tobacco belt, where the bright-leaf variety that would define American smoking was already displacing the older, heavier strains. And Winston had just been connected to the Northwestern North Carolina Railway, which meant that anything manufactured in that small Piedmont town could reach any depot in the country. Reynolds bought a lot beside the railroad tracks. He purchased his first factory building from the local Moravian church congregation and established what he called the Little Red Factory, a 2-story frame structure that covered less ground than a tennis court. In the spring of 1875, he hired a crew of seasonal workers and began producing chewing tobacco. By the end of that first year, the factory had turned out 150,000 pounds of product. The figure was modest. Winston alone had 15 other tobacco manufacturers. But Reynolds had not come to Winston to compete. He had come to own it, and the methods he would use to do so would become a template for the family's approach to every obstacle it encountered for the next century, whether the obstacle was a rival manufacturer, a murder investigation, or a body of medical evidence. Through the late 1880s, Reynolds introduced an innovation that remade the chewing tobacco market. He began adding saccharin to his flu-cured plug, producing a sweeter, more durable chew that outsold every competing product. The Reynolds factory in Winston expanded from a single building to a sprawling complex whose structures were the largest in the town, fitted with steam-powered machinery and electric lights at a time when most of Winston still used kerosene. His younger brother, William Neal Reynolds, known throughout the Piedmont simply as Mr. Will, left Trinity College to manage the company's leaf purchasing operations, and the 2 brothers built a partnership that combined R.J.'s appetite for expansion with Mr. Will's administrative precision. The R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company was chartered by the state of North Carolina on the 11th of February, 1890. Through the decade that followed, Reynolds bought out competing tobacco factories in Winston one by one, absorbing their workers, their equipment, and their market share until the Reynolds Company produced approximately 1/4 of all the chewing tobacco consumed in the United States. The company's payroll fed families across the Piedmont. African-American workers migrated from South Carolina and from the surrounding countryside to fill positions in the Reynolds factories, forming a labor force that was essential to production and segregated within it. Reynolds personally contributed $500 to help establish the Slater Industrial and State Normal School for African-American students, because no one on the local Board of Trade would fund it. It was a characteristic gesture of the Reynolds approach to civic life, simultaneously generous and strategic, the kind of investment that bound a community more tightly to the man who paid for it, a true display of generosity. By 1900, Winston was no longer a town with a tobacco company. It was a tobacco company with a town arranged around its factory gates. The railroad that had drawn Reynolds south now carried Reynolds tobacco to every state in the Union, and the Reynolds name was attached to so many of the institutions, streets, and enterprises in the city that the distinction between the company and the municipality had become a polite formality. But the achievement had not gone unnoticed. 300 miles to the north, in Durham, another tobacco man had been watching Reynolds's rise with professional interest and proprietary intent. His name was James Buchanan Duke, and he controlled the American Tobacco Company, the third largest corporation in the United States. Duke did not tolerate competitors. He absorbed them. James Buchanan Duke had built the American Tobacco Company into the third largest corporation in the United States by the same method R.J. Reynolds had used to capture Winston. He purchased rivals. He undercut holdouts on price until they capitulated. And when a manufacturer proved too stubborn or too successful to ignore, Duke offered a deal that functioned less as a partnership and more as an annexation. In 1899, the American Tobacco Company absorbed the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company on precisely those terms. The arrangement was not a merger, it was a leash. Duke permitted Reynolds to continue operating his factories in Winston, to manage his own workforce, and to expand his product lines in chewing tobacco and pipe tobacco, provided he observed one condition. Reynolds was forbidden from manufacturing cigarettes. Duke controlled the national cigarette market through his trust, and he intended to keep it. Reynolds, who had spent 25 years building an empire in chewing tobacco, was now the largest and most profitable subsidiary of a corporation run by a man in Durham who regarded him as a tolerable regional asset, not a peer. The Reynolds factories in Winston continued to operate under the Reynolds name, with Reynolds managers and Reynolds workers producing Reynolds products. But the profits flowed to Durham, and the strategic decisions that mattered were made in Duke's offices, not in Winston. A lesser industrialist might have chafed visibly or plotted an exit. Reynolds did neither. He treated the trust years as an education in national markets and used Duke's distribution network to study the mechanics of selling a branded consumer product across state lines and into every general store, drugstore, and tobacconist in the country. While the trust held him, Reynolds launched Prince Albert smoking tobacco in 1907. A pipe tobacco blend packaged in a distinctive red tin and marketed with an advertising campaign that blanketed billboards, streetcar cards, and newspaper columns from New York to San Francisco. Prince Albert became the first genuinely national tobacco brand, sold in every state in the Union, and it was manufactured entirely in Winston. "I am a competitor by nature," one associate later recalled Reynolds saying, "and a patient man by necessity." The patience was strategic. Reynolds was studying how to sell a branded product to a continent, and the American Tobacco Trust was paying for the lesson. The trust's dominance, meanwhile, had attracted precisely the kind of attention Duke had spent years trying to avoid. The Department of Justice, under the authority of the Sherman Antitrust Act, filed suit against the American Tobacco Company in 1907, the same year Reynolds launched Prince Albert. The case wound through the federal courts for 4 years. On the 15th of May, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered the American Tobacco Company dissolved into 34 separate companies. The trust was broken. Reynolds was free. It was one of the defining ironies of American industrial history that the government's campaign against monopoly handed R.J. Reynolds the single advantage he had lacked for 12 years. The dissolution did not weaken him, it liberated him. Reynolds emerged from the trust with his factories intact, his workforce trained, his national distribution knowledge sharpened by a decade of operating Prince Albert through Duke's channels, and the one restriction that had constrained him since 1899 permanently removed. He could now manufacture cigarettes. And unlike James Buchanan Duke, who had built his cigarette empire by purchasing existing brands and consolidating them under the trust, Reynolds intended to build something new from the Winston factory floor. The company Reynolds had built in Winston was, by 1911, the largest independent tobacco manufacturer in the South, with annual revenues that placed it among the most profitable enterprises in North Carolina. The factories that lined the railroad corridor through the center of town employed thousands of workers, and the Reynolds name dominated the city's commercial life with a thoroughness that other American industrialists achieved only through formal company towns. Reynolds had no need for a company town. The town had become the company voluntarily, bound not by barbed wire or scrip, but by payroll, philanthropy, and the absence of any meaningful economic alternative. R.J. Reynolds had spent 12 years inside the American Tobacco Trust, learning how national cigarette distribution worked, waiting for the legal system to return the one freedom Duke had denied him. The Supreme Court had now provided it. Within 2 years, the first Camel cigarettes would roll off the production line in Winston-Salem, and the tobacco industry in America would never be the same. In 1913, the same year that the towns of Winston and Salem formally merged into a single municipality, R.J. Reynolds introduced a product that would reshape American consumer culture more thoroughly than any invention since the sewing machine. The product was the Camel cigarette. Before Camel, most Americans who smoked cigarettes rolled their own from loose tobacco purchased in tins or pouches. Pre-packaged cigarettes existed, but they were considered inferior, a convenience for city dwellers who lacked the patience or the skill to roll a proper smoke. Reynolds understood that the objection was not to the package, but to the blend. He developed a cigarette that combined bright-leaf flue-cured tobacco with Turkish and domestic burley in a formulation that produced a milder, smoother flavor than anything the hand roller could achieve at home. The cigarette was the product, the blend was the argument, and the advertising campaign that accompanied it was unlike anything the American consumer market had seen. Before the first pack of Camels reached a store shelf, Reynolds dispatched advance teams to cities across the eastern seaboard with instructions to post a single cryptic message on billboards, in newspapers, and on handbills. The message read, "The Camels are coming." No product was named. No company was identified. The campaign generated precisely the kind of speculation Reynolds intended. When the cigarettes arrived, bearing a package illustrated with a dromedary camel photographed at the Barnum and Bailey Circus, the public already knew the name. It was among the first teaser advertising campaigns in American history, and it worked with a thoroughness that startled even Reynolds's competitors. Within a year, Camel cigarettes were selling in every state in the Union. The scale of what followed belongs to a category of American commercial achievement that is difficult to overstate and impossible to celebrate. By 1918, the year R.J. Reynolds died, the company employed 10,000 workers in 121 buildings spread across Winston-Salem. By 1920, Camel had captured a larger share of the American cigarette market than any single brand in the country's history. By 1925, more than one of every 2 cigarettes smoked in the United States was a Camel. The Reynolds Company's annual production exceeded tens of billions of individual cigarettes, manufactured in a factory complex that stretched along the railroad corridor through the center of Winston-Salem like a second downtown. The town that had contained 400 people when Reynolds arrived in 1874 now owed its hospitals, its schools, its banks, and its municipal infrastructure to the proceeds of a single product sold in a paper package for 15 cents. R.J. Reynolds did not live to see the full extent of his creation. On the 29th of July, 1918, at the age of 68, he died at Reynolda House of pancreatic cancer. The man who had built the most successful cigarette company in the United States was killed by a cancer of the organs in a body that had spent decades in proximity to the curing barns, the manufacturing floors, and the raw leaf of the tobacco plant. No one at the time drew the connection publicly. The cause of death was recorded, and the funeral was held in Winston-Salem, and the company continued without him. His brother, Mr. Will, assumed leadership. The machinery did not pause. But the cigarette R.J. Reynolds had designed was not merely a consumer product. It was, in the language a later generation of scientists would use, a delivery system, engineered to carry nicotine into the lungs with an efficiency that no pipe, no cigar, and no plug of chewing tobacco could match. Each inhalation deposited tar and particulate matter into tissue that had not evolved to receive it. The product that had made Winston-Salem the wealthiest city per capita in the American South was performing, with each puff, a transaction that would not be fully understood for another 40 years. The smoke entered the lungs of millions, and for the moment, no one was counting what it left behind. The fortune, however, was already being spent. While R.J. Reynolds had been building his cigarette empire on the factory floors of Winston-Salem, his wife Catherine had been building something else entirely on 1,000 acres of North Carolina Piedmont, just northwest of the city limits. She called it a bungalow. It was something closer to a vision. Catherine Smith was born on November 17, 1980, in Mount Airy, North Carolina, the eldest daughter of a prosperous local businessman. She graduated from Sullins College in Bristol, Virginia, in 1902, and shortly afterward accepted a position as personal secretary to R.J. Reynolds at the Reynolds Tobacco Company offices in Winston. She was his first cousin once removed. She was 30 years his junior. A romance developed between the tobacco magnate and the young woman from the foothills, and on February 27, 1905, they were married in a quiet ceremony in Mount Airy. The couple returned to Winston and settled into a house on West 5th Street within walking distance of the Reynolds factories. Catherine did not withdraw from her husband's business. She entered it. She initiated reforms in the tobacco factories that the workforce had never requested and that Reynolds himself had not considered. She installed water fountains on the production floors. She arranged for hot lunches to be served to workers during their shifts. She established a nursery for the children of working mothers and persuaded Reynolds to permit later arrival times for female employees so they could attend to domestic responsibilities before reporting to the factory. These were not radical acts by the standards of the progressive era, but they were unusual in the tobacco industry and unprecedented in Winston, where the relationship between the Reynolds Company and its workers had been defined by paternalism, not by accommodation. Catherine introduced a different premise. The workers were not merely instruments of production. They were residents of a community whose health and education the Reynolds family bore some responsibility to support. The fullest expression of that premise was Reynolda. Beginning in 1910, Catherine acquired parcels of farmland northwest of the Winston city limits, eventually assembling a property of 1,067 acres. She hired the Philadelphia architect Charles Barton Keene to design the main residence and the landscape architect Thomas Sears to lay out the grounds. The house, completed in 1917 after 7 years of construction, contained 60 rooms. Catherine always referred to it as the bungalow. Despite its scale, the residence was designed with restraint rather than ostentation, its green clay tile roofs unifying the structure with the surrounding farm buildings in a deliberate aesthetic of rural modesty. But Reynolda was not a house. It was a village. The estate encompassed a model dairy with the first concrete-floored milking barn in the region, a greenhouse, a blacksmith shop, a post office, a school, 2 churches, a central power and heating plant, a 16-acre man-made lake, a 9-hole golf course, tennis courts, and cottages for the estate's workers, from the family chauffeur and stenographer to the head dairyman and the village schoolmaster. The outbuildings were designed to resemble an English village, arranged along lanes and pathways that gave the compound the appearance of a self-contained community rather than a plantation. African-American farm laborers lived in a separate settlement known as 5 Row, located a quarter-mile from the village on the edge of the estate, within the architecture of segregation that Catherine's progressivism did not extend to dismantling. The most revealing feature of Reynolda, however, was the farm itself. Catherine designed the model farm not as a hobby or a decoration, but as a working demonstration that diversified agriculture could sustain the Piedmont without reliance on tobacco. The estate grew vegetables, raised livestock, operated a commercial dairy, and experimented with scientific farming techniques that Catherine promoted to local farmers through educational programs on the grounds. It was a deliberate countercrop, an argument made in soil and seed that the region did not need to depend on the single commodity that had built every dollar of the Reynolds fortune. The woman married to the tobacco king spent a decade building a showcase farm whose central thesis was that tobacco was not the only way to live. The paradox was not lost on her, though she appears never to have stated it publicly. The fortune that paid for Reynolda's dairy barns and demonstration fields came from the same factory floors where she had installed the water fountains. Catherine would not have time to see the argument settled. R.J. Reynolds had died of pancreatic cancer in 1918, 7 months after the family moved into the finished house. Catherine carried on alone, concentrating on educational reform and the management of the estate. In 1921, she married J. Edward Johnston, the principal of the Reynolda School. On May 23, 1924, 3 days after giving birth to a son, Catherine died of an embolism in a New York hospital. She was 43 years old. She left behind 4 Reynolds children and a newborn. The eldest, Richard Jr., was 18. The youngest, Zachary Smith Reynolds, was 12. They had lost their father to cancer and their mother to childbirth within 6 years. The fortune remained. The estate remained. The company that generated both continued to grow. But the family that the fortune was meant to sustain was now a collection of orphans in a 60-room house, inheritors of a name that meant everything in Winston-Salem and nothing to the children who bore it without parents to explain what it required of them. The Reynolda estate was placed in trust after Catherine's death. The children would not take full possession until the eldest came of age, and in the interim the property and the family's affairs fell under the stewardship of William Neal Reynolds, R.J.'s brother, the man Winston-Salem still called Mr. Will. He was a competent administrator and a loyal guardian, but he was an uncle, not a father, and the Reynolds children grew up in a household defined by the absence of the two people who built it. Richard Jr., the eldest son, was quiet, steady, and inclined toward the family business. Mary Catherine, who would marry Charles Babcock and eventually acquire the estate, inherited her mother's sense of civic obligation. Nancy Susan was the most private of the four, and Zachary Smith Reynolds, the youngest, born on the 5th of November, 1911, inherited something none of the others appeared to possess in the same measure. He inherited velocity. Smith Reynolds was not interested in tobacco, in farming, or in the administration of a fortune. He was interested in flight. By his mid-teens, he was taking flying lessons, and before he turned 18, he had earned his pilot's license and was barnstorming across the American South in open-cockpit biplanes. He was 6 years younger than Howard Hughes, wealthier by inheritance than Hughes was by the same age, and possessed of the same appetite for altitude and risk that characterized the first generation of American aviators. In 1929, at 17 years old, Smith married Anne Ludlow Cannon, a member of the Cannon textile family, in a ceremony that merged two of North Carolina's wealthiest industrial dynasties. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Smith spent much of it in the air. While Smith Reynolds was learning to fly above the Piedmont, the family company was remaking the skyline below him. In 1929, the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company completed construction of its new corporate headquarters in downtown Winston-Salem. The Reynolds Building, designed by the New York architectural firm of Shreve and Lamb, rose 21 stories and 314 feet above Main Street, an Art Deco tower of limestone and granite that became, upon its completion, the tallest building in the American South. It was also the prototype for a more famous structure. The Reynolds Building won the National Association of Architects Award for Best New Building of the Year, and the recognition earned Shreve and Lamb the commission to design a larger version of the same concept for a client in New York City. 2 years later, the Empire State Building opened on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, 102 stories tall, its tiered crown and clean vertical lines, a direct architectural descendant of the tobacco company's headquarters in Winston-Salem. The fortune built on chewing tobacco and Camel cigarettes had produced the blueprint for the most recognizable skyscraper on Earth. The scale of Reynolds's hold on Winston-Salem by the end of the 1920s is difficult to convey without stacking the figures. The company was the largest employer in the city by a factor that made comparison meaningless. The Reynolds Building housed the executive offices on the 19th floor, and the saying in Winston-Salem was plain: "Nothing gets done in this town unless it's approved on the 19th floor." The family's combined landholdings included the 1,067-acre Reynolda estate, the factory complex that occupied dozens of city blocks along the railroad corridor, and residential neighborhoods the company had built for its workers. The Reynolds family's philanthropic contributions had funded schools, churches, a university, and a hospital. The Reynolds name appeared on the city's most prominent high school, its tallest building, its largest employer, and its most visited estate. Winston-Salem was not a company town in the formal sense. The company issued no scrip and built no fences, but the effect was the same, achieved through payroll and generosity and the sheer gravitational weight of a fortune that had no local rival. Into this architecture of inherited wealth and civic dependence, Smith Reynolds moved with the restlessness of a young man who could go anywhere and belonged nowhere. He had a pilot's license, a divorce, a $20 million inheritance waiting for him at age 28, and no occupation that required him to be in any particular place at any particular time. In 1931, while attending a touring performance, he encountered a singer whose voice and reputation would change the trajectory of the Reynolds name. Her name was Libby Holman, and she was the most famous torch singer on Broadway. Elizabeth Lloyd Holtzman was born on the 23rd of May, 1904, in Cincinnati, Ohio, the daughter of a lawyer and stockbroker. She changed her name to Libby Holman, subtracted 2 years from her age, and arrived in New York City in the mid-1920s with an ambition that matched her voice. By 1929, she was a Broadway star. Her signature performance of Moanin' Low in the revue The Little Show had established her as the preeminent torch singer of her generation, a woman whose low, smoky contralto and sexually charged stage presence drew audiences that could not look away, and critics who could not decide whether to be impressed or scandalized. She was openly bisexual in an era when that admission could end a career. She was credited by admirers with inventing the strapless evening gown. She was, by every measure available to the New York theatrical world of 1930, a woman whose fame was built on the deliberate transgression of the boundaries that most women of her class were expected to observe. Smith Reynolds encountered Libby Holman at a touring performance in 1931. He was 19 years old, freshly divorced from Anne Ludlow Cannon, heir to a tobacco fortune that would pay him $20 million on his 28th birthday, and possessed of the particular recklessness that attaches to young men who have unlimited resources and no one to answer to. Holman was 27 at the peak of her Broadway career and accustomed to the attention of wealthy admirers. Smith was different only in degree. He spent a fortune following her from city to city, attending every performance, and pursuing her with an intensity that his family in Winston-Salem regarded with increasing alarm. The Reynolds family had survived the transition from founder to second generation with its conservative social reputation intact. Winston-Salem society operated according to the conventions of the Upper South, where wealth was expected to be exercised discreetly, and marriages were arranged, if not formally, then through the careful alignment of suitable families. Libby Holman was not suitable. She was Jewish, theatrical, bisexual, and famous for a style of performance that the Winston-Salem establishment considered indecent. She maintained a close and widely discussed relationship with Louisa Carpenter, a member of the DuPont family of Wilmington, Delaware. The Reynolds family's objections were social, cultural, and, in the language of the period, moral. Smith Reynolds disregarded all of them. Days after his divorce from Anne Cannon was finalized, Smith married Libby Holman on the 29th of November, 1931, in a secret ceremony before a justice of the peace in Monroe, Michigan. The couple embarked on a world tour that took them to Hong Kong and across the Pacific, a honeymoon conducted at the velocity Smith preferred. When they returned to Reynolda House, Libby brought with her a stream of her theatrical friends from Broadway and Greenwich Village, guests whose manners, politics, and personal arrangements clashed headlong with the conservative rhythms of the Reynolds estate. The household staff observed. The Reynolds family seethed. The marriage, barely 5 months old, was already operating under pressures that neither the bride nor the groom appeared equipped to manage. Smith Reynolds had told associates that he intended to fly around the world, a feat that would place him in the company of the era's most celebrated aviators. He was restless, volatile, and given to dramatic pronouncements that his friends had learned to interpret as performance rather than intention. "I'm going to end it all," he reportedly told Albert Walker, his childhood friend and personal secretary, on multiple occasions, a threat that Walker later testified Smith had made 7 or 8 times over the course of their friendship. Whether Walker believed him, and whether Libby believed him, would become the central question of the investigation that followed. By the early summer of 1932, the marriage had reached a point of open friction. Libby was pregnant. Smith was drinking. The around-the-world flight had been postponed. The Reynolds family had made their disapproval of the marriage plain to everyone in Winston-Salem, and the Broadway friends who had briefly enlivened Reynolda House had largely returned to New York. What remained was a 20-year-old heir and his 28-year-old wife, alone in a 60-room house on a 1,000-acre estate surrounded by the architecture of a fortune that neither of them had built and that both of them were struggling, in different ways, to inhabit. On the night of the 5th of July, 1932, a party was held on the grounds of Reynolda House. The evening would end with a gunshot. The party on the grounds of Reynolda House that evening had been organized to celebrate the birthday of one of Smith Reynolds's friends. Guests moved between the lake, the formal gardens, and the main house. Alcohol flowed freely. The mood among the guests was festive, though several would later testify to undercurrents of tension between Smith and Libby that surfaced throughout the evening. At some point during the party, guests observed what appeared to be a kiss between Libby Holman and Albert Walker, Smith's childhood friend and personal secretary. Whether Smith witnessed it, and what he made of it, became the subject of conflicting accounts that would never be reconciled. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, the population of the house narrowed to its essential figures. Smith Reynolds, Libby Holman, and Ab Walker remained. The sequence of what happened next exists in at least 3 versions, none of which corroborated the others. According to Walker's account, delivered to investigators in the days that followed, Smith came downstairs at some point after midnight and approached him in an agitated state. Smith announced that the planned around-the-world flight was canceled. "Our trip is off," Walker later testified Smith had said. "I'm going to end it all tonight." Smith threw his wallet at Walker and told him he could keep it. Walker testified that Smith had made similar threats on 7 or 8 previous occasions, and that on this particular night he did not believe the threat was any different from the others. According to Libby Holman's account, delivered after she claimed total amnesia for the first 48 hours following the shooting, she was lying on the bed in the sleeping porch on the 2nd floor of Reynolda House when she awoke to find Smith standing over her with a pistol pressed to his own head. She described the moment as sudden and disorienting. She offered no account of what preceded it. What the physical evidence recorded was this. Sometime shortly after midnight on the 6th of July, 1932, a single round from a Moser automatic pistol struck Zachary Smith Reynolds in the right temple and exited beneath his left ear. The bullet continued through the sleeping porch and embedded itself in the woodwork near a window approximately 7 feet above the floor. It was a brood year for periodical cicadas in the southern Appalachian foothills, and the chorus of insects outside Reynolda House was so dense and continuous that the night watchman on the estate grounds heard the gunshot only as a muffled pop, indistinguishable from the ambient noise of a Carolina summer night. The sound that ended the Reynolds heir's life was swallowed by an accident of entomology. Forsyth County Sheriff Transu Scott arrived at Reynolda House and examined the sleeping porch. The blood pattern, the position of the wound, and the trajectory of the bullet troubled him immediately. A self-inflicted gunshot to the right temple from a man standing upright would be expected to travel on a roughly horizontal path or angle slightly downward. The bullet that killed Smith Reynolds traveled through his skull on a trajectory that carried it upward and across, exiting beneath the opposite ear and striking a point on the wall 7 feet above the floor. The geometry did not fit a man holding a pistol to his own head. Sheriff Scott sketched the scene and noted his reservations. The county coroner, working from the available testimony, ruled the death a suicide. Scott did not concur. Smith Reynolds was carried from the sleeping porch, placed in an automobile, and driven to North Carolina Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem. He died there on the morning of the 6th of July, 1932. He was 20 years old. He left behind a pregnant wife, a contested fortune, and a crime scene that the sheriff believed had been disturbed before his arrival. Furnishings on the sleeping porch appeared to have been moved. The Moser pistol was found in a location that did not correspond to where it would have fallen from Smith's hand if he had shot himself while standing. The accounts offered by the 2 people who had been nearest to him at the time of the shooting were not only inconsistent with each other, but internally contradictory when measured against the physical evidence. The coroner's ruling of suicide satisfied no one who examined the details. The sheriff's suspicion of homicide satisfied no one who understood the implications. If Smith Reynolds had not killed himself, then the 2 people who had been on the sleeping porch with him, or near it, were the wife who stood to inherit a portion of the largest tobacco fortune in the South, and the best friend who may have been her lover. The case that Forsyth County would now have to build would put the Reynolds family's name, its fortune, and its most closely guarded private arrangements on trial in a public courtroom. The family had spent 60 years ensuring that nothing in Winston-Salem happened without their approval. The murder of their youngest member was about to test whether that authority extended to the criminal courts. The death of Zachary Smith Reynolds generated a media response that Winston-Salem had never experienced, and that the Reynolds family had spent decades working to prevent. Wire services dispatched correspondents to the Piedmont. Newsreel cameras appeared on the streets of Winston-Salem and at the gates of the Reynolda estate. The New York Daily Mirror published a 27-part series on the case that accused Libby Holman of being, among other things, a sensuous sex pirate, a red-hot mama, an iceberg of disdain. The combination of tobacco wealth, Broadway glamour, sexual scandal, and violent death proved irresistible to a Depression-era press that had few stories as lurid and as socially stratified as the one unfolding at Reynolda House. On the 8th of August, 1932, Libby Holman traveled to Wentworth, the seat of Rockingham County, North Carolina, and surrendered herself on a charge of first-degree murder. She was accompanied by her father, a Cincinnati lawyer, and 2 additional attorneys. Albert Walker was charged as an accomplice. Holman posted bail with funds provided by Louisa Carpenter, her companion from the DuPont family, and was released within 2 hours. The crowd that gathered in Wentworth to witness her arrival filled the small courthouse square, and the newsreel footage that survives from that afternoon shows a woman walking through a press of reporters and onlookers with the practiced composure of a performer accustomed to being watched. The trial was scheduled for the fall term of the Forsyth County Superior Court. It never took place. Approximately 1 month before the proceedings were to begin, the chief prosecutor received a letter from William Neal Reynolds, Smith's uncle and the family patriarch, requesting that the charges be dropped. The letter did not argue innocence. It argued privacy. The Reynolds family's position, conveyed through Mr. Will's correspondence and through the attorneys retained to manage the family's interests, was that a public trial would expose the private conduct of their late nephew to scrutiny that would damage the family's reputation and, by extension, the reputation of the company that bore their name. The family preferred silence to verdict. 2 days after the letter was received, the charges against Libby Holman and Albert Walker were dismissed. The coroner's original ruling of suicide was allowed to stand. No alternative theory was tested in court, and no witness was cross-examined under oath. The forensic inconsistencies that had troubled Sheriff Scott, the bullet trajectory, the disturbed crime scene, the contradictory accounts from the two people nearest to the victim, were sealed inside the Reynolds family's preferred version of events and left there. On the 10th of January 1933, Libby Holman gave birth prematurely to a 3.5-pound boy she named Christopher Smith Reynolds. The child, known as Topper, was now an heir to the Reynolds tobacco fortune. The estate settlement, finalized in March of 1935 after a prolonged legal contest between Holman and the Reynolds siblings, awarded Libby $750,000 and Christopher more than $6 million. The remaining portion of Smith's $20 million inheritance was divided among his daughter from his first marriage, Anne Cannon Forsyth, and his siblings Richard Jr. and Mary Reynolds Babcock. In honor of their late brother, Richard and Mary established the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, which would become one of the largest philanthropic institutions in North Carolina. The settlement figures tell the story of a family disposing of a problem with money. $750,000 for the widow, $6 million for the son, a foundation for the brother's memory, and an unsolved homicide for the public record. The Reynolds family had purchased something more durable than an acquittal. They had purchased the end of the conversation. The conversation, however, would continue in other forms. Hollywood produced at least 3 films inspired by the case, including Reckless in 1935, starring Jean Harlow in a role modeled on Libby Holman, and Written on the Wind in 1956. Libby herself never returned to Reynolda House. She raised Christopher at Treetops, a 55-acre estate she built in Stamford, Connecticut. When Christopher died at 17 in a climbing accident on Mount Whitney in California in 1950, Libby used the Reynolds tobacco money to establish the Christopher Reynolds Foundation. One of the foundation's first grants funded the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1959 trip to India to study the principles of Gandhian nonviolence. The fortune built on tobacco, passed through a murder, filtered through a climbing death, became one of the financial instruments that helped launch the American civil rights movement. The Reynolds name had traveled a path that no one in Winston-Salem could have foreseen. But in Winston-Salem itself, the company that bore the name was not looking backward. It was looking at the largest consumer market in the history of the world, and it was preparing to fill it with smoke. The Second World War delivered to the American tobacco industry a marketing gift that no advertising campaign could have replicated. The United States military included cigarettes in the rations distributed to servicemen overseas, and millions of young Americans who had never smoked before the war returned home with a habit acquired in foxholes, barracks, and field hospitals across Europe and the Pacific. The tobacco companies did not create the policy. They benefited from it with an efficiency that their own sales departments could not have engineered. By the end of the war, the American cigarette market was larger than it had ever been, and the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company was positioned to dominate it. In 1948, Reynolds entered the new medium of television with a sponsorship that would define the early years of American broadcast journalism. The Camel News Caravan, anchored by John Cameron Swayze, became one of the first national television news programs in the United States, airing nightly on NBC, with the Camel cigarette brand woven into every broadcast. The program opened with Swayze seated behind a desk with a burning Camel cigarette visible in an ashtray beside his notes. The news of the world was delivered to American living rooms under the Reynolds Company's name, and the implicit message was clear: cigarettes were not a vice. They were a companion to the routines of informed, respectable American life. Reynolds followed the Camel franchise with two additional brands that would become fixtures of the post-war tobacco market. In 1954, the company introduced Winston, a filter-tipped cigarette whose advertising slogan, "Winston tastes good like a cigarette should," became one of the most recognized phrases in American commercial history. In 1956, Reynolds launched Salem, the first filter-tipped menthol cigarette, opening an entirely new product category. By the late 1950s, the Reynolds Company was manufacturing three of the best-selling cigarette brands in the country from its factory complex in Winston-Salem, shipping billions of cigarettes annually to every corner of the United States and to markets overseas. The scale of American cigarette consumption in the post-war decades requires its own accounting. In 1912, a medical survey of the world's scientific literature could identify only 374 verified cases of lung cancer on Earth. By 1960, lung cancer had become the leading cause of cancer death among American men, and the rate was climbing among women. The average American adult was smoking more than 4,000 cigarettes per year. The Reynolds Company's annual revenues ran into the billions of dollars. The company's workforce in Winston-Salem had expanded to more than 16,000 employees, and the factory complex along the railroad corridor had grown into one of the largest tobacco manufacturing operations on the planet. In 1956, the company amended its corporate charter to permit investment in non-tobacco enterprises, a decision that signaled both the scale of the cash surplus the cigarette business was generating and the first institutional acknowledgement that a company built entirely on tobacco might someday need to be built on something else. The Reynolds family, meanwhile, had receded from direct management of the company their patriarch had founded. The enterprise that R.J. Reynolds had run from his office in the Little Red Factory was now a publicly traded corporation managed by professional executives and governed by a board whose connection to the founding family grew more attenuated with each passing decade. The Reynolds name remained on the building, on the brands, and on the philanthropic institutions that funded schools and hospitals across the Piedmont. But the family no longer controlled the decisions that determined what the company did, what it knew, and what it chose to conceal. And the company, by 1960, knew a great deal that it had chosen not to share. The same laboratories that had developed the Camel blend and the Winston filter and the Salem menthol had also been producing internal research on the relationship between cigarette smoke and human health. The findings were unambiguous. The evidence was accumulating in company files in Winston-Salem with a clarity that the public would not encounter for another 3 decades. The R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company knew that its product caused cancer. It had known for years, and it had decided, with the deliberation of a corporation that had been managing inconvenient truths since the night a bullet passed through the sleeping porch at Reynolda House, that the knowledge would remain inside the building. The internal evidence began accumulating in the early 1950s. In 1953, a confidential report prepared for the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company noted that clinical data supported the theory that cigarettes could be cancer-causing agents. The report was not published. It was not shared with regulators, with physicians, or with the millions of Americans who were smoking Reynolds products. It was filed. In 1962, Dr. Alan Rodgman, a scientist employed by R.J. Reynolds, produced an internal assessment that went further. Rodgman characterized the accumulated evidence linking cigarette smoking to cancer and other serious health conditions as overwhelming, and described the evidence challenging that link as scant. The Reynolds Company had its own researcher telling it, in writing and on the company's own stationery, that the product it sold to the American public was killing its customers. The company's response was not to withdraw the product, to reformulate it, or to warn consumers. Its response was to ensure that the public never encountered the evidence that its own scientists had compiled. The mechanism for that concealment was constructed in 1954. In January of that year, the major American tobacco companies, including R.J. Reynolds, published the frank statement to cigarette smokers in more than 400 newspapers across the United States. The advertisement acknowledged public concern about the health effects of smoking and pledged the industry's commitment to transparent research. It was a document of calculated reassurance, designed to look like accountability while committing to nothing. That same year, the tobacco companies established the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, ostensibly to fund independent scientific investigation into the health effects of smoking. The committee's actual function, as internal documents would later reveal, was to identify, fund, and publicize any research that contradicted the emerging scientific consensus and to suppress or discredit any research that confirmed it. The goal was not to find the truth. The goal was to prevent the truth from settling into a form that regulators and courts could act upon. The strategy was given its most precise articulation in 1969 in an internal memorandum circulated within a subsidiary of the tobacco industry. The memo contained a single sentence that would become one of the most cited documents in the history of corporate misconduct. "Doubt is our product," the author wrote, "since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public." The sentence was not a confession. It was an operating manual. The tobacco industry had identified the scientific consensus as its commercial enemy and had determined that the most effective competitive strategy was not to disprove the science, but to manufacture the appearance of legitimate disagreement where none existed. The 1964 report of the United States Surgeon General had declared, in language that left no room for equivocation, that cigarette smoking was a cause of lung cancer. The tobacco industry's public response was denial. Philip Morris stated that same year that it did not accept the premise that harmful agents existed in tobacco. Behind closed doors, R.J. Reynolds and its competitors continued to fund the disinformation apparatus they had built a decade earlier, channeling millions of dollars into research programs designed to produce doubt and into public relations campaigns designed to distribute it. The targeting of consumers, meanwhile, extended into territory that the internal documents themselves described with a candor that their authors evidently believed would never become public. In the 1990s, an R.J. Reynolds marketing plan bearing the title Project Scum was developed to targeting populations in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. The acronym stood for Subculture Urban Marketing. The plan identified homeless individuals and people with mental illness as a demographic whose smoking rates were high and whose likelihood of quitting was low. It was not a leaked allegation or an unverified rumor. It was a named, documented corporate strategy, written on company letterhead, filed in company archives, and eventually disclosed to the public through litigation. The Reynolds Company had moved from concealing the dangers of its product to deliberately targeting the Americans least equipped to resist it. The disinformation campaign lasted 4 decades. The internal documents that eventually exposed it numbered in the millions. When courts and congressional investigators finally compelled the tobacco companies to open their files, the University of California, San Francisco, established the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents Library to house and digitize the material. The archive grew to more than 19 million pages, representing the most comprehensive record of sustained corporate deception in American history. The documents revealed not only that the tobacco companies knew their products caused cancer, heart disease, and respiratory illness, but that they had known it for decades and had built an institutional infrastructure specifically designed to ensure that the public did not. The evidence would eventually reach a courtroom, and when it did, the company that R.J. Reynolds had built in a two-story factory beside the railroad tracks in Winston would face a reckoning that no amount of advertising, no disinformation committee, and no family intervention could forestall. Before the reckoning arrived in the courtroom, it arrived in the boardroom. The R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company had spent the 1960s and 70s diversifying into food, packaging, and energy, and in 1985 the conglomerate merged with Nabisco, the National Biscuit Company, to form RJR Nabisco. The union of Camel cigarettes and Oreo cookies was managed from Winston-Salem by a succession of executives whose relationship to the Reynolds family and to the city that had built the fortune was, by this point, largely ceremonial. The last of them was F. Ross Johnson, a Canadian-born corporate executive who presided over RJR Nabisco with a style of personal extravagance that the original R.J. Reynolds, a man who had started with $7,500 and a recipe for chewing tobacco, would not have recognized and would not have tolerated. Johnson maintained a fleet of corporate aircraft that employees referred to as the RJR Air Force. He relocated executive perks, expanded expense accounts, and treated the conglomerate's cash flow as a personal resource. In October of 1988, faced with a stagnant stock price and the commercial failure of a smokeless cigarette called Premier, Johnson proposed taking RJR Nabisco private through a management-led leveraged buyout valued at $17 billion. The bid attracted the attention of Henry Kravis and George Roberts of Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, the private equity firm that had pioneered the leveraged buyout as a financial instrument. Kravis regarded Johnson's attempt to buy the company with its own money as both an opportunity and an affront, and he mounted a competing bid. The contest that followed became the most publicized corporate takeover in American history. Investment banks, law firms, and competing bidders fought over the company for 6 weeks in a spectacle of financial ambition that journalists Brian Burrow and John Helyar would chronicle in their 1989 book, Barbarians at the Gate. On the 24th of November 1988, the board of RJR Nabisco accepted a revised bid from KKR valued at $25 billion, $109 per share. It was the largest leveraged buyout ever completed, a transaction that loaded the company with debt, enriched its departing executives, and severed the last institutional connection between the Reynolds tobacco enterprise and the city where it had been founded. The corporate headquarters moved from Winston-Salem to Atlanta. The workforce in the Winston-Salem factories, which had once numbered more than 16,000, began a contraction that would continue for decades. The Reynolds Building downtown, the Art Deco tower whose design had inspired the Empire State Building, stood over a city that was learning what happened when the single enterprise around which an entire municipality had organized its economic life decided to leave. Winston-Salem in the 1990s resembled the aftermath of a company town whose company had not closed but had simply lost interest. The legal reckoning, when it came, matched the scale of the deception it addressed. In 1997, Mississippi became the first state to settle its lawsuit against the tobacco industry. Florida, Texas, and Minnesota followed, recovering a combined $35 billion. On the 23rd of November 1998, the Attorneys General of 46 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 territories signed the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement with the 4 largest tobacco companies in the United States, including R.J. Reynolds. The settlement obligated the tobacco companies to pay a total of $206 billion to the settling states over 25 years. The agreement banned the use of cartoon characters in cigarette advertising, eliminating the Joe Camel mascot that had become one of the most recognized brand symbols in American marketing. It prohibited outdoor and billboard advertising. It banned tobacco brand sponsorship of sporting events and concerts. It required the tobacco companies to open their internal files to public scrutiny, producing the document archive that would eventually grow to 19 million pages. And it established and funded the American Legacy Foundation, later renamed Truth Initiative, to conduct the public education campaigns that the tobacco companies had spent 4 decades working to prevent. In 2006, United States District Judge Gladys Kessler delivered the ruling in the federal government's civil racketeering case against the tobacco industry. The opinion ran 1,682 pages. It identified 145 distinct acts of racketeering. It concluded that the tobacco companies have not ceased engaging in unlawful activity and could not be trusted with the responsibility of identifying and implementing the necessary changes in their own companies. The judge found that the companies would likely continue to commit fraud indefinitely into the future if left to regulate themselves. The company that R.J. Reynolds had built beside the railroad tracks in 1875 had survived a founder's death, an orphaned dynasty, an unsolved murder, a leveraged buyout, and a corporate relocation. It did not survive its own documents. The files that the company had generated, circulated, and stored over 4 decades of institutional deception became the instruments of its legal undoing. The smoke that the company had sold to millions of Americans had left a paper trail that no amount of corporate restructuring could burn. The Reynolds Building in downtown Winston-Salem is a hotel now. The Art Deco tower that once housed the executive offices of the largest tobacco company in the United States has been converted into the Kimpton Cardinal Hotel, where guests can sleep in rooms that once processed the logistics of selling billions of cigarettes to the American public. The factory complex that stretched along the railroad corridor through the center of the city has been repurposed as well. The buildings that once manufactured Camel, Winston, and Salem cigarettes now house the Wake Forest University School of Medicine, Forsyth Technical Community College, and more than 60 research and technology companies. The city that tobacco built has spent the last 3 decades learning how to breathe without it. Reynolda House stands on a reduced portion of the original estate, surrounded by the gardens and pathways that Zachary Smith Reynolds designed more than a century ago. It opened to the public as a museum of American art in 1967, and visitors can walk the rooms of the 60-room bungalow that Catherine built and that her children grew up in, and that her youngest son was carried out of on the morning of the 6th of July, 1932. The sleeping porch on the 2nd floor, where the Mauser pistol fired and the cicadas swallowed the sound, is part of the tour. The outbuildings of Reynolda Village, the dairy barns, and the blacksmith shop, and the schoolhouse that Catherine envisioned as a self-sustaining community, are now boutique shops and restaurants. The model farm that was meant to demonstrate that the Piedmont could survive without tobacco operates today as a set of demonstration gardens maintained by Wake Forest University. Catherine was remembered after her death as a woman with a broad vision for the present and keen foresight for the future. The future arrived, and it confirmed the one thing her vision had tried to say. The murder of Zachary Smith Reynolds was never solved. The charges against Libby Holman and Albert Walker were never reinstated. Libby Holman spent the remaining decades of her life performing blues and torch songs, supporting the civil rights movement, and losing the people closest to her with a regularity that caused one acquaintance to call her the Black Angel of Death. On the 18th of June, 1971, she was found in the front seat of her Rolls-Royce in the garage of her Connecticut estate. Her death was ruled a suicide. She was 67 years old. The product, meanwhile, continued to kill on a scale that the Reynolds family's original fortune could not have imagined, and that the company's internal scientists had tried, in memoranda and reports filed and forgotten, to warn against. The World Health Organization estimates that tobacco use caused 100 million deaths worldwide during the 20th century. In the 21st century, the toll continues at approximately 8 million deaths per year. In the United States alone, cigarette smoking kills more than 480,000 people annually, more than alcohol, automobile accidents, illegal drugs, murders, and suicides combined. Tobacco remains the single leading preventable cause of premature death in the nation, where R.J. Reynolds built his Little Red Factory beside the railroad tracks in 1875. The R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company still exists. It operates from Winston-Salem as a subsidiary of Reynolds American, which was itself acquired by British American Tobacco in 2017. The company that R.J. Reynolds founded with $7,500 and a crew of seasonal workers is now a division of a multinational corporation headquartered in London. The name remains, the factory remains, the smoke remains, and at Reynolda House, on 1,000 acres of North Carolina Piedmont, that Zachary Smith Reynolds once imagined as something better than what paid for it, the tour continues.